Thank you very much, Jim, and welcome everybody to this UCL Applied Linguistics seminar. I'm going to speak very briefly to introduce the speakers and also to introduce the focus of the session. Glenn and I have just published a collection of papers called Language Learning of Adult Migrants in Europe. There's a collection of papers mostly from Northwest Europe, focusing on the ways in which adults acquire language mostly within formal systems, but also within informal systems in the European context. Glenn is going to begin the seminar by introducing this book, introducing the context in which it was written, and the collective message from the papers. And following that, we've got two presentations from two of the authors of chapters in the book. The first is Professor Anke Grotlüschen of the University of Hamburg, who's going to present a paper that looks quite broadly at the German system and how, in that particular moment, the German system adapted and what lessons we learned from seeing that squeeze, looking particularly at the data. And Anke is probably the most authoritative voice on adult learning in Germany, certainly, but I would imagine in Europe as well. I'm very, very pleased to have you with us, Anke. I'm really looking forward to what you're going to say. The third person is another person who I've collaborated with for a long time, Nafisah Graham-Brown, who I don't think has actually come into the room yet, so hopefully she will pop in. She is. Okay, so Nafi will also introduce her chapter. Hello, you're here. Good. We'll also introduce her chapter, which is a much smaller study, a qualitative study of adult learners in London and their social integration and their linguistic integration through particular activities related to Nafi's work. As many of you know, Nafi was, or still is, Director of Skills for Life at ELATT, a London charity, and also co-chair of NATECLA. So I'm going to hand over straight to Glenn to introduce the book and introduce the subject of today's seminar. All of us in thinking about the themes today, I think with any theme we would be talking, it's impossible not to think about the current situation in Ukraine, where new stories of language learning of migrants are being forced upon people as we speak. So I don't want to say too much about this, but and I'm sure we need to acknowledge it and remind ourselves that of the people we're talking about often have had those experiences before they arrived, and they're highlighted in this research. Glenn, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is really, really exciting that you helped put this together and bring all these people together. It's really wonderful. I wish we could do this more often this way. And I guess it's one of the advantages of this digital format is that it lets people from all over the place just drop in and attend something like this at lunchtime or in whatever time zone you're in. And I'm very excited too, partly for what you say, is that unfortunately there's a renewed timeliness to a lot of what you're going to hear today, maybe even an urgency to some of what's in this volume. So my purpose in this presentation, in this short bit of the session that I have, is to introduce this volume that David and I co-edited, which is going to print even as we speak, hopefully. And like the volume, my aim here is to provide you with some hopefully useful insights and questions, something to spark discussion, but also reflect, excuse me, a reflection about your own teaching practices or your own research, or both. So at the outset, I'd like to welcome several of the volume's contributors are actually here, apart from Nafi and Anke, who you'll hear from in a few minutes. But I saw Sylvia Melo-Pfeiffer and Mara Turkis and Rola, and I'm not sure if Minna also showed up in the meantime. David, in a few minutes, I might actually invite them to add a comment to what I'm going to say when I go through the volume, because they can speak better than I can. So at that time, maybe you can elevate them to the privileged status of speaker here. As David indicated, the impetus for this volume was the large increase in migration to Europe due in large part to violent conflicts in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and several countries in sub-Saharan Africa, beginning in 2014 and peaking largely in 2016. And it does seem like a long time ago now, but indeed, I think that the insights and evidence and observations of our volume really speak to what I believe is going to be sort of a renewed increase in the need for migrant language learning, as we now see really an unprecedented number of people on the move and arriving in Germany, arriving in many countries of Europe, including the European Union. So,
Glenn, really sorry to interrupt. So you've got something rubbing against your microphone.
Oh, thank you. I'm so sorry.
No, it's all right.
I often don't remember that. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm actually gonna I'm gonna set a timer because I want to keep mine as short as possible, my presentation, because I really want to give as much of the time as possible to Anke and Nafi to do their presentations. Okay. Oh, wait. So here's what I'll do really quickly. I do want to share some of the considerations that David and I took a close look at in writing our introduction, but also in sort of organizing the contributions to this volume. And right here, I'm just going to talk about this question of, why are we focusing on Europe? What is it about Europe that was interesting and worthy of our attention? And then I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes looking at a few of the really important terms and processes that we also felt span through the contributions of the volume, and that I think I should put into the spotlight here for a moment. And then I'm going to give a very brief overview of the whole volume, so that you have a sense of what it is we were trying to do and what our contributors accomplished. So first, some considerations. Why focus on Europe? And this is sort of very thumbnail, but one reason we felt Europe is special as a region, as a target for, or an arrival site for so many migrants, is that multilingualism is so integral to Europe and the idea of European integration and cooperation. And not that other regions don't have this, but for instance, if you compare it to my own country, the United States, I think there are some quite clear distinctions to be drawn. Second, social democratic governments throughout Europe make it part of their job to provide language instruction to newcomers, which is also, I think, something special about the European Union. Third is a more demographic consideration. Unlike perhaps some other regions of the world, Europe is aging demographically, and migrants, in fact, represent more than just people who need help, but rather where Europe actually needs help because they represent Europe's future. And language learning is crucial to that process. And then finally, I'll just mention that Europe is peculiar in some ways in that it has a long and fraught colonial past, mingled with its linguistic diversity. And many of the newcomers, in fact, come from former colonial holdings, which complicates the whole issue of migration still further. So we felt that while migration and language learning of migrants, in fact, has many commonalities around the world, there were enough factors that contributed to the uniqueness of Europe that let us focus on that. Additionally, we noted in many of the contributions, as well as in much of the literature about multilingualism in Europe, and especially if you delve into policy documents, is sort of an ongoing tension between the ideals of Europe and the European Union in particular, and the realities. And the ideal is, of course, this formal valorization of multilingualism, for instance, through the 1+2 policy, or integration programs that are framed as sort of essential to the European project and the European Union across many different kinds of policy statements and documents. And that butts up against the reality, which is that there's still, even though there's multilingualism, there's what many researchers have called a monolingual bias throughout Europe, in which there's a very heavy and sometimes sole emphasis on the national languages of Europe that come under the heading of that multilingualism, and in the process, sort of a marginalization of many linguistic minorities. And finally, I'll just mention sort of part of this tension is also a rather neoliberal understanding of integration, which I'll come back to in just a couple of minutes, that sort of sometimes stands in conflict with the ideals or the idealism of language learning. So one of the things that David and I did through our many discussions in planning the volume, as well as working through the contributions, is to try and sort of unpack and nail down how we and how our contributors are using different key terms. I can't go through all of them here. I'll mention just a couple, the most important of them being from the title of the volume, and that is migrant, where, on the face of it, the straight up definition is people who've left their new homes to settle in a new one. And Kelsey says, usually for economic reasons or merely to pursue a better life. And in terms of education, it's often used to distinguish this population of learners from other learners, presumably for their benefit. And we do note that over time, the term migrant is seldom used by migrants themselves. And I put this quote here from Charlotte Taylor, that naming is not merely an academic practice, even though that's what it is for us in this volume, but a product of or the product of so-called political correctness, but a negotiation which takes place continuously and sometimes aggressively in everyday life. And we tried to keep that in mind as we use this term. And additionally, also the term refugee, where in fact, most of the contributions in our volume focus on that sort of subgroup of migrants. We felt it was important to point out that seldom is that term used neutrally by the media or by political leaders. And we are mindful of the fact that, this label refugee in some ways forecloses an equal power relationship between so-called hosts and newcomers. Even if on the face of it, as you see in the UNHCR definition on the right, the definition of refugee is pretty straightforward and neutral, but its use is seldom neutral. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Okay. I am going to skip ahead because I do not want to leave out having enough time in my short bit of time to go through the volume and talk about the volume. But here I'm talking about both integration and literacy, both of which are also terms that should be taken critically and used with a critical eye at all times. And we tried to do that too. So the goals of our volume were to contribute to a conceptual framing of migrant language learning, one of numerous contributions of recent years that are contributing to that very important work. We wanted to provide empirical evidence of the impact and effectiveness of both national systems in place, such as what Anke will present in a few minutes, as well as less formal or informal settings, such as in community centers or other settings that you wouldn't label as, a language class per se. We also wanted to provide a practical resource in our volume for language professionals, and that includes teachers, of course, but also administrators and policymakers. And as I indicated in the opening bit, we hope that the contributions here also provide some insights into some of the particularities of Europe that make it an interesting site of study and understanding language learning of migrants overall. So in our volume, we ended up with 9 chapters in addition to our introductory chapter, and focusing on these countries of Northwestern Europe. It was more by the process than intention that we ended up with these countries. And in our introductory chapter, we do go into a bit of detail about why we think that was from our call that went out. And as mentioned, we have chapters that focus both on formal and informal learning settings. We have some large scale, big picture analyses of large data sets, but we also have several intimate investigations of individuals and communities. And the really cool thing is the 2 presentations you'll hear today will give an example of each of those. I'll go through really briefly, and oh, I'm sorry, I mistyped your name, Minna. I was typing too fast. I don't want to put our co-authors on the spot who are not presenting today, but I know we have several of them here. I'm not sure if Minna showed up since we started. She indicated she would try and come, but maybe if you would like to actually just chime in when I'm talking about it and maybe make a comment or 2 about your chapter, you're welcome to. You don't have to, but this seems like a nice setting to do that if you want to. So the first chapter after the introduction is by Minna Anke Hernandez, and she looks at migrant mothers' stories in Finland. And it's a really delightful ethnographic study that took place over 6 years. And she uses nexus analysis, which is a strand of discourse analysis, to identify different sorts of language and is able to identify sort of these 2 directions that language use goes in, of sort of pastime usage and managing situations. That's really fascinating and I think helpful, especially for people who think about and design curriculum and try and orient language to being useful that migrants acquire. Is Minna here? And did you want to add anything or say anything? David, is she here?
I don't think she is. I haven't seen it.
Okay. I will not talk about Nafisah Graham-Brown's talk because she's going to do that in just a little bit, where she did a study of the relationship between migrant women's social interactions and their perceptions of their own integration. The next chapter is Vanessa Piccoli from France, where she did a detailed, a very fine-grained, essentially conversation analysis, and actually a multimodal conversation analysis of talk between patients and therapists about language learning among, in this case, a subset of refugees, in fact, asylum seekers in France. And her paper provides some really useful insights into the psychological impacts of learning a new language. And in particular, she really lays out for us the tensions between everyday life and the learning of the language. And further, she shows how many of the learners are quite aware of these tensions as well as of the cognitive dimensions of language learning. In the second part, we look at language learning in the classroom. And in chapter 5, Anke Grotlüschen and her colleagues Wienberg and Dutz, who you'll hear from in just a couple of minutes, look at empirical evidence from the German integration course system, and I won't say more about it here. The next chapter also looks at the German integration course, which I believe Anke will probably tell you what that is, so I won't take time, by Anna Tissot and colleagues, where they actually are trying to look at determinants predictors of language acquisition in integration courses through a longitudinal survey that they triangulated with numerous interviews with respondents, but also teachers and administrators. And they use human capital theory to try and identify factors that contribute to or hinder language acquisition in these courses, particularly as it emerged from the data, particularly for women. In chapter 7, Amina Al-Daif and Graham Hall and Roland Nabe, who I think one of you is here. They look
yes,
at
Glenn. Yes. I'm here, yes.
religion, identity and investment in adult learners in the UK. And this is a really also just a lovely nuanced ethnographic investigation of the very complex relationships that learners have with the whole idea of integration. And I don't know if you want to take just a minute of my time here and say something about sort of the main contribution that your study makes.
Sure. Thank you very much, Glenn. I really enjoyed this introduction as well. And I came to know more also about some of the chapters. And I think like part of although the chapter introduces the experience of only one female refugee, it's actually part of a larger scale study that involved like 14 adult learners and followed them for almost 2 years. So Amina herself is a Syrian refugee as well here in the UK, and she followed these learners for almost 2 years, trying to identify all the factors that impacted their investment in attending and in learning the language, but also some of them acquiring literacy for the first time. And this was also one of the unique aspects of like the experience of the newly arrived migrant in the last, let's say 10 years. Literacy in the first language was an important factor, but also how their identities are shaped by their experiences and also by their investment in terms of the language investment and also literacy investment. So this is kind of a brief overview, but I think it shows exactly some of the issues. It highlights some of the issues that you mentioned at the start, for example, that integration is most of the time is viewed as one-directional by most of the people involved other than the migrants themselves, and how much the migrants are invested in learning, but other factors play an important role in their integration, linguistic integration in particular.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, I particularly think that contributions like this one that analyze the role of religion and religious identity in the process of language and culture learning are really important, and we need more of them. The last 3 chapters, also language learning in the classroom. Anke Norlund Shaswa analyzed literacy practices in Sweden, and particularly looked at how digital media are used in everyday life, and then shifted the focus to consider how digital literacies could be brought to bear in the language classroom, where currently, at least in that learning setting, they aren't. But she does a good job of showing how they could and should be. Sarah Cox also does an ecological ethnographic study, taking what she calls a multilingual approach, and looking at ways that we can, through instruction, validate and integrate multilingual realities in the everyday lives of language learners and the curriculum, sort of seeing everyday lives and language learning in the classroom as part of one system, and that we should approach our instruction that way too. It's also, I think, one of the more creative applications of translanguaging pedagogy that has become sort of widely employed in recent years. And then the last chapter is a very interesting study of assessment of plurilingual, multilingual refugee students in foreign language classes in Germany. And it's our only study that doesn't look at the acquisition of the dominant language, but rather other languages, foreign languages in school. And the authors really uncover some very interesting tensions between sort of traditional or conventional ideas about assessment and then plurilingual approaches where the teachers themselves seems to have sort of an idealism about this, but it butts up against the conventional approaches. And I think, Sylvia, did you want to take a minute of the time and say something about your study? Or Mara? I think
perhaps Mara would like to take the floor as well, but thank you for this presentation. I don't have too much to say about this, just perhaps that we uncover the monolingual mindset in foreign language education at school. And we made relative small but qualitative and in-depth analysis of interviews with foreign language teachers in order to see how they evaluate kids that are newly arrived to the German educational system. So it's kind of the intimate investigation, as you were saying previously. And we show the dilemmas or the tensions that arise when these teachers need to evaluate, to apply standards from the educational system to these students, and the dilemma or the tension that arises also from the need to differentiate their skills, their competences, but also what they have been through. So I won't tell that much, otherwise you won't read it afterwards. I don't know, I just leave the floor to Mara if she wants to say something as well. Thank you.
I think there's nothing left to say for me, but I feel like it's a general tension that teachers frequently face. I'm a teacher myself, so you frequently face the difference between your personal aims to help the students in class versus like what the government wants these kids to achieve in school. So they're like, on the one hand, you need to have standardization in school because otherwise it doesn't work. But on the other hand, you, as a person, as a teacher, wants to help everybody, but it's hard to achieve. So I think that's what the study shows. But I think Sylvia already said everything about it.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I think it's kind of a cool thing that we have. We would have liked to have had a session where we have all 10 presentations, but that would of course be just a whole day. I did see that in the chat, Dominic mentioned that I had said, oh, the definition of refugee is straightforward. I hope you understood, I put up the UNHCR definition because it on the face of it appears fairly neutral, but my point is in fact just what you say, that the interpretation of that definition or the use of it actually by so many different people, whether politicians or the media, and even often in research, is anything but straightforward. As you say, it's always taking a political stance, whether in support of or unfortunately often antagonistic toward exactly that segment of the population. And therefore, I think in research, it's especially important to clarify how you're using that term for this group of people, which in reality, in fact, are highly heterogeneous and vulnerable as well. Okay, I have used more of my time than I had intended to, but I'm glad we got to hear from a couple of the authors, and I'm gonna end there and turn it over because we're gonna hear from Anke and then Nafi.
Thank you, Glenn. Excellent stuff. Thank you very much. Anke.
The button how to unmute myself. I restarted.
We can hear you now.
That was nice. Okay, thanks, Glenn, for reminding us of especially all the technical terms and the problems around labeling and the distinction or the differences between the ideal world and the realities in this area. And it's also, for me, pretty nice to have a short overview well, about the way and the idea of the volume. And yes, the terminology on refugees, on whatever, is quite difficult in Germany as well. So we called our paper Language Learning of Migrants, and that's when the first problem comes in. Who are migrants in this case? I would say a couple of words about it. And when we talk about empirical evidence from the German integration course system, with the focus on literacy courses, things get rather complicated, so I have to explain a bit about the system before we jump to conclusions. I'll come to the findings. And the reason why we work with large-scale assessments or with large-scale data is that we have access to it. That's because of our position in the discourse. We have access to people from the Interior Ministry and the authorities that launched these integration course systems. So we were able to ask for secondary analyses of their data sets. But that does not mean that I would say that only large-scale or statistical representative studies have something to say in this area. I find it much more interesting to go into details. And you will easily see why, because we just don't have some of the data that are very relevant. And that makes it clear why the combination of qualitative and quantitative work completes the picture somehow. We got involved into teacher training for people who teach in the integration course system after 2015, and I fully agree that there was a lot of discussion, a lot of wording that used kind of catastrophic metaphors like flood or crisis or wave and so on. And I would also suggest to avoid these metaphors, especially with the forthcoming group of people from Ukraine. And we use two different data sets that we got access to after 2015. And that's why I would like to say at least a few words about the German integration course system. And this is about learning German and not about learning English. Learning to read and write in home languages. We use data from the integration course statistics and integration course tests. Both are system data. That means they are not made for research, and that means we hadn't any chance to define which variables we need. I will present some selected findings and then go to a discussion. Actually, I just jumped in from a meeting of the German Volkshochschulen, that's the major association of providers in the section in this area, those who provide integration courses. And there were some representatives from the political parties that are currently in power, and others from the NGOs and society. That the discussion was mostly on how to handle the forthcoming population of Ukrainians who will arrive here, and how to prepare for this. And we have, at least that was new to me, that's why I shared it with you. We have at least a clarification that people have a 3-year permit to stay, an immediate permit to work. They have the right to get at least entry courses regarding the German languages. Entry courses means something like 3 months. They have the right to get immediate access to integration courses. And there will be probably, has nothing to do with language learning, probably a larger adult education program on peacekeeping and reconciliation after the war. So we try to not fully break personal contact with people in Russia or the civil society in Russia, but already prepare to somehow use our experiences with civic education and political literacy in order to prepare for the next level of what's lying before us. That was very emotional, and I find it difficult to jump somehow into findings from the integration courses that were addressed to post 2015 migrants. But however, I suppose this will be part of the discussion afterwards anyway. So when I talk about post 2015, we use the term Neuzugewanderte, that equals more or less recent migrants. And Geflüchtete, that means those who have fled. The term refugees would mean Flüchtling in German, and it has two connections. First, it is, as you say, it is L-I-N-G. Flüchtling is somehow minor to the host or whoever is major also. The second issue is that the term Flüchtling in Germany means that it is an official status which with a recognition as having certain rights, but those who came in and whom we call those who have fled, Geflüchtete, do not yet have any rights. They just enter into a system where they can apply for the refugee status. So they get social benefit and so on, but they do not have their status, and that definitely means they have they do not necessarily have access to the labor market. After 2015, most people came from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, but tens of thousands also came from numerous other countries, mostly the Balkans and the Northern African states. Most of those who were from Balkan countries and Northern African countries did not get the refugee status, and that caused a lot of problems because many of them didn't have any way to come back and any opportunity to go back to that country. The German integration course system, this is that's the reality. That is not the ideal. The ideal would be to work with people and take integration as a two-way approach that kind of changes those who arrive, but also changes the hosting society. But this is definitely not the philosophy of the integration course system. The integration course system, and sorry, this is German, the picture is German, has at least two very relevant course systems that are offered to new arrivals or to Neuzugewanderte. When you see UE here, this is Unterrichtseinheiten, that is training hours, 1 training hour equals 45 minutes. So you see the regular Allgemeiner Integrationskurs, general integration course here, has some 600 training hours in language learning, meaning German, 60 training hours, today 100 training hours in civic education. We think that people from abroad have no idea about civics. Most of them came here because they have an idea, because they want a democracy and they want equality between genders and so on. But that's how we treat them, as having no knowledge about this kind of issues. And you see, we have extended the 60 training hours on civic education towards 100 training hours on civic education, because Muslims need definitely more training in this area than those we had before. It is a very difficult discussion. However, you have the right to get 600 training hours in language training, plus another 300 training hours extra when you think you are not ready to the test yet, ready to take the test. You have to take the test in order to receive your social benefit, but you do not have to pass the test. You still get your social benefit when you do not pass the test, but you have to take it, and you can retake it at least once. Those who have literacy questions as well, that was true for many Syrians, they are offered 900 training hours in German, plus 60 to 100 training hours in civic education, plus another 300 training hours, extended version, to prepare to get ready for the test. Literacy in the German discussion means learning to read and write the German alphabet, Latin German alphabet. For many who come, that means learning a second language, learning to write a second language because they were literate in Arabic or Russian or Cyrillic or Greek literacies. So it is mostly addresses people who learn a second script. But we also have refugees from Africa, from Eritrea, who are eligible to attend these courses. and some of them are directed toward the literacy classes, and those people mostly never had much training, maybe 1 or 2 years of basic schooling, but not more. So the heterogeneity, the courses are pretty heterogeneous. We tried to find out how well did the German integration course system overall meet the demand in the wake of the increase in the number of migrant learners of German, of the German language since 2015, and what are the indications for meeting it ongoing, and how successful was the literacy course as part of the German integration course system, especially between 2015 and 2018. An overall look, I don't know, many details. We use the so-called Integrationskurs Geschäftsstatistik. That's very German. We put words together and have a long word. That's the integration course data, regularly published by the Integration Authority. We just integrated their data over the years. We got access to some extra data, that's course test data. The data set reaches from 2015 to 2018 with test data by country, gender, age, but not by formal qualification, because the authority does not have the right to ask their applicants for formal qualification information. Test data can be detailed by speaking, writing, and reading, listening. That's different from the longitudinal study that the Tissot team works with. And test performance in writing is always lower in each country and everywhere, lower than the other two. So writing is the real challenge. And if you know words like Integrationskurs Geschäftsstatistik, you know why. You can see from one of the overall statistics that the pass rates, the test results by CEFR level, are decreasing since 2012, but especially after 2015. So the first row is showing, or the first line is showing those who passed the test with the best possible excellence. So that's CEFR B1 level. So that's more or less the course aim, to bring people to a level where they can get by in Germany without help of others. Not necessarily being on the C level, that would be scientific English or scientific German in reading and writing, but B1 is quite a good starting point for living and working in Germany. You see the number of those who pass, or the percentages of those who pass at the B1 level decreases. At the same time, those who pass at the A2 level, the lower level, rises, and the number of those who do not pass the test because they are below A2 also rises, and this is since 2015. And one of the most relevant explanations is that before 2015, even in the literacy courses, we mostly had people who were somehow familiar or in contact in a certain way with the Latin alphabet. They may have not attended school for a long time, but they live like Bulgarians, Romanians who lived in a surrounding where the Latin alphabet is present all day, which is different when people come from Syria. You see the test results by country of origin. The reds are those who pass at the lowest level, and the pinkish is middle level, and the gray ones are on the highest, on the B1 level. And what is interesting is that Iran, out of those who are represented in this data set, obviously has the lowest share on those who do not pass the test or pass with very low qualifications or language skills. A substantial share of those who have intermediate results, and quite a good share of those who have higher results. You see that things are quite obviously quite easier for people who come from Romania. That's what I said. this is a European country with free movement. Free movement means people come to Germany to work. They have the right to enter the literacy courses, but they live in a surrounding where the Latin alphabet is quite represented or quite present. And of course, people who are from Germany but have literacy needs or language needs who enter the courses have are quite successful. But that's what we expect when you live in Germany anyway. We know from other statistics that Iranians who come to Germany in many cases have high formal qualifications, and that may be the major explanation for these findings. Gregor, especially our stats person who currently is on vacation, worked or performed on a logistic regression. That means odds ratios are presented, figures above 1 mean people have a better chance to perform, to pass the test, and figures below 1 mean that people of this group have a lower chance to pass the test compared to the reference category. And in terms of gender, we decided that the reference category in this case is male. And you see that women in general have performed better than men in writing and listening and reading, but not in speaking. You see the overall test results. Women have a 15% better chance to pass the test than men out of this sample. But you see in speaking, they have a non-significant but slightly lower chance to pass the test, while in writing and in listening and reading, so both categories where literacy is involved, they perform better than the men in the same sample. And you know that the sample size is several thousand, but the sample is not representative for anything except those 3 years of test takers. So it's a full statistic, a systems statistic, and not a representative sample out of the population. Later years of tests, you can also see age affects the chances to pass the test, affects it negatively. The older you are, or the older the refugees or the Neuzugewanderte are, the lower their chances. The year of test has a negative effect in the early year in 2015. Those who came early or those who already have been here and entered the system had better chances to pass the test. And those who came later have lower chances to pass the test. And we have some differences, some between country differences, but the country differences do not match with any causal assumption. Like, for example, people from Arabic countries may have more difficulties to pass the test because of Arabic being so different from Latin. So that was not confirmed by the data. So we don't know how to interpret the country results. Please keep in mind that from all those countries, we also have refugees or Neuzugewanderte who come into the integration course system, but not necessarily into the literacy classes. Those who go directly to the general integration course probably have better results, they pass the tests more easily and so on. Those who enter the literacy classes are people who definitely have not enough skills or not very good skills in the Latin alphabet. And if you think about the countries and the countries of origin, my assumption, at least, is that people come from whatever, the Arabic world, and know the Latin alphabet. They probably know it because of schooling and foreign language learning in whatever, English, French, and so on. And they probably don't need to learn the Latin alphabet anymore. And that also means they are mostly, those with a better formal qualification do not end up in literacy classes, but they go to the general integration course.
Okay.
That's what we would like to pass over, right?
Yeah. No, just about 5 minutes.
Okay. So the test performance gets weaker every year. This shows that either the weaker formal qualifications of the later Neuzugewanderte are a reason. Those who have lower formal qualifications do not necessarily have the means to easily leave their country when it's necessary, or the course quality does not meet the needs of the Neuzugewanderte, especially because the later courses, you know, it was so difficult to find teachers and to set up courses, and maybe both reasons are or maybe traumatized migrants or Neuzugewanderte, or people who do not understand or do not really accept that it is necessary to learn German because they are not allowed to stay in Germany for a long time. So women in this sample perform better in writing and words and speaking. That is interesting. As in other tests, we found that speaking is generally easier than writing for all populations, men as well as for women. And we would ask that the migration authority needs to take data on formal qualification, as this is probably a core reason for the effects. And we need to prepare for the Ukrainians. The Hamburg University already start their help programs. And as said before, the German folk high schools also discuss how to integrate the newcomers, who in many cases will be able to not only speak Ukrainian, but also Russian. And we have a lot of formerly Russian migrants who may be able to help to bridge the language gaps at least. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anke. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. So looking at across the whole system there are so many points at which, yeah, we would like to stop and explore in more detail and try and understand why, particularly now at this point where you're planning for, you know, the next round. And is it going to be the same system that tries to stretch itself out and incorporate a new group of people, or is something different possible that's maybe more targeted and maybe more understanding of the individuals who are passing through it? But let's see if we've got time later on for more questions, and we can come back to all these. But thank you very much, Anke, a real pleasure. I'm going to pass over now to Nafisah Graham-Brown. Nafi, if you'd like to come on and present your paper on belonging. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Really happy to be here, and thanks, Glenn, for the introduction. That was great. While I'm talking, I'm just trying to share my screen. Sorry about this slight wait. Okay. Hi, everyone. Hope you can see me okay in here. So thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to present. So as Glenn and David already alluded to earlier, this chapter is a condensed version of my research. And my research is about the experiences of migrant women learning English as they attempted to integrate into their local communities. And my focus was on their social interactions in English that they took part in, and how these affected the perception of their own integration. And I used a framework of belonging to explore this. So just to give a bit of background, as similar to kind of what Anke's already talked about, people settling in different countries, for us migrant women in the UK, face multiple barriers to settling. There's language barriers, knowledge of systems. Yeah, there may be a perception of their civic knowledge. They need to know a bit more about their rights, and also just how to communicate with others and the diverse groups of people they might encounter, and to construct new relationships with people outside of the groups that they were familiar with previously. So this lack of knowledge, together with the lack of language skills in the new language, often affected women's participants' levels to take part in social interactions, and these then affected other areas of their lives. One of the organization I work for is ELATT, and that is where my research was based in. And we've been delivering programs to support integration of refugee and migrant groups for a really long time across London. And one of the main challenges that our clients told us was to find opportunities to have these social interactions, to have meaningful interactions with other people in their local communities. So this was what drew me in the first instance to take a look at what their experiences were. And I found that this was an under-researched area. There's not much research about people's out-of-class language use. There's a lot of research about kind of teaching and learning within ESOL. And so I wanted to look at this. The other thing that drew me to this research was the pervasive view that migrant women were reluctant to learn English and reluctant to integrate. And this was something that had been driven by kind of government narratives and also media narratives. And generally our strategy up to more recently had been influenced and derived from EU integration policy. And so it's been an area that the government and lots of organizations have been trying to look at, deal with. A lot of reports from policy groups and from government focused on the issue of learning English. And because people were perceived to not want to learn English, they then were perceived to live parallel lives, this term parallel lives. But I knew, as someone who worked with people that I was supporting on a daily basis, this was really an incorrect depiction of our students. And I really wanted to share their different experiences of their journey or pathways to integration through this research. And finally, another thing that came to me when I was looking at starting this research was that there was actually a very little evidence to show how, if someone achieves a certain level of language competency, they then are automatically integrated. So the rationale was really to research that relationship between learning English and integration. And these, oh, sorry, wrong click. And so these were kinds of the things that drew me to doing this research. So as I've said, give voices to the people we're working with, contribute to a body of research, to advise policy, and to support my organization where possible with new ideas. And I just very quickly want to use this definition of integration because as we've already discussed, integration is probably, is a contested concept. And so this is the definition that I've used in my research, which was derived from earlier research, which is that it's the process by which people who come to the UK become part of a society, but with responsible multiple responsible parties, including the host communities and the government. So I just wanted to share that before I went any further, so that we're all in the, everybody can understand what I'm coming to the research with. So really, the question for me was to kind of look at a framework to suggest that relationship. So this is what I set out to do. In my research, I suggest that there's a relationship between language socialization and integration. I myself subscribe to the social cultural theory of language acquisition, and this is that cognitive development and language learning takes place as a result of social participation. And one of the theories that comes under that umbrella is language socialization. And this theory proposes that novices are socialized into communities of practice across the life course to use language appropriately in culturally significant activities through socialization using the same language into local values, beliefs, theories, and conceptions of the world. Sorry, that's a real mouthful. And that was a definition by Howard. I've got a reference here if anyone wants to share it, but of course you'll find it in our book. So really what it is that it's to support someone to be inducted into a new group or community using the new language that they're learning, and also to be able to use that language that they're learning. So it's a process of really gaining all aspects of language learning, which are not, in my opinion, not just about kind of the straightforward technical skills, but also things that are to do with the social experience, the social use of language. And this idea of language socialization is derived from Ed Sapira's work on culture, language, and identity, as well as upon Bourdieu's theory of practice. And this kind of idea hypothesized that society was organized into social fields. So not as you can see, but this diagram here shows kind of a broad social field. And within fields, individuals interact through social interactions in language to accumulate economic, cultural, and social capital. And within this, language can be considered cultural capital gained through interactions in these specific social fields. And social capital is the resources or potential resources that people gain from the participation and membership of a field, but it is perpetual. So a person's participation in a field develops their identity. In this situation, I've used the term habitus, or their individual identity. And through their participation using language, they then influence the identity and the space around them. So this is a framework that I thought was very useful to explain what was happening with the experiences that my participants were going through in their everyday lives out of the ESOL classroom. Not when I say out of the ESOL classroom, I'm talking about periods of non-directed study by the teacher. So moments of interactions with other classmates and then the experiences of interaction with other people outside of their ESOL classroom. And so that was a framework. I started off with looking at kind of language socialization, and then I wanted to see how that interacted with the idea of integration. So as I mentioned earlier, these definitions are contested. Lots of people have different ideas of what integration means, and I've already set out where I've come from. And I suggest that there are definitely multiple responsible parties within this idea of supporting someone to become integrated, but then it's also experienced differently by individuals. And so I think that is what I found problematic in reading was how that there was an idea of indicators of integration that might not be supporting individual experiences. And actually what I found was Breyer's study in 2013 was actually really useful, because instead of the traditional perception of integration being kind of a two-way, like this one person does one thing and then they receive something. They actually thought that integration was more akin to a spaghetti junction of transitory moments of belonging. And this really struck a chord to me, because the experiences that I was hearing about with people I was working with, my students and participants, really gave this kind of impression of being able to feel quite integrated or belonging in a certain sphere or a certain place that they were interacting in or living in, but then maybe not in other places or spheres. So I started investigating this a bit more and found this term belonging cropping up quite a lot actually in papers and documents and policies, and this idea that belonging was the thing that indicated successful integration. So I thought, great, if I could just find what is belonging, then we can, I can really use this to see how my participants feel about their integration. But then I actually found that there wasn't much about belonging anywhere. So although the term was used in a lot of papers and a lot of research, that nobody had actually, not many people had actually looked at what the term meant or defined it. And it took me a while, but I did find a number of versions of belonging. And so there were a number of ways belonging had been used in other spheres, not necessarily within migrant integration and language integration. Actually, it's used a lot in the school, primary and secondary schooling and higher education. So this was something that I kind of looked at and wanted to see whether there was any crossover. And actually, I came upon the concept of place belonging, which it starts from the idea of belonging being a human need. Some of you may recognize, and I'm really sorry if I get this name wrong, Baumeister's and Leary's work about belonging. And basically it builds on the idea that belonging is a sense of ease with where you are. And Vanessa May, who I quote quite a lot in my research because I found her research really interesting and was resonant and relevant for me, was the idea that these are in different contexts that people experience in their daily lives. So in this situation, belonging is understood as an attachment to a place, but places are not just physical spaces, because an idea of place includes the social meanings that people give to a place from the interactions that happen within it. So it becomes more of a 3D experience rather than just four walls. And so I found that was, really interesting, and started looking at it as how people experience then their perceptions of belonging within different places that they interacted in. And I found that, this belonging is experienced through multiple aspects. They're interrelated, they're layered, and it's all simultaneous, even though my diagram here is a very 2D representation of it. And sorry, I know I'm rushing a bit. I don't note that time is running, and I'd like to get a bit further into my findings. But these are the 4 aspects that people experience belonging in, according to May's research. And, I've adapted that as well to take into consideration the context of my participants. So very quickly here, as you can see, material belonging, these are about physical spaces, but also about the ability to access and opportunities to do so. Cultural belonging, these are about the social behaviors and rules of engagement. Cultural identities and knowledges do come into this, but actually it's what I found from the research and my reading was that it's more the unwritten behaviors within spaces that are culture, that really support someone's cultural belonging, but also language comes into this, and how someone's able to kind of use language within the particular and distinctive ways of life of the group. Relational belonging is about interactions and relationships with others, and the chapter really focuses mainly on my participants' relational belonging for the rest of the chapter. And temporal belonging is about the experience over time, the life stories, and also the relationship between memory, self, and time. But this isn't an aspect that I focused much on in my research, as I didn't have enough time and space, unfortunately. So I had research questions which I wanted to answer, as many of us do in our research. So I wanted to know about their prior experiences, where they were participating in social interactions, and the nature of the social interactions within places, and then what their feelings about their belonging in these places were. I used a narrative inquiry method. You can read a little bit more about my journey to that in the chapter. And I also used oral diaries to supplement the data. And these were using handheld recording devices, which I gave participants, and they would record their experience, not whilst having a social interaction, but after they had social interactions, they'd be given a crib sheet to answer some questions and record their experience. And so I ended up with 5 3/4 hours of oral diary recordings from this, which was very rich data, and 14 narrative interviews, which were of varying length, but generally over an hour each with participants. And so I worked with 6 participants. It's very small scale compared to the research study we just saw a moment ago. And I really like that fact that we have that contrast here today. And the participants were working mainly at entry level 3 or level 1, which is the equivalent to B1, B2, CFR. And this was so that I didn't have to use interpreters, and based on that language level, I felt that it would be possible for them to share their stories. It was opportunistic, but representative, because ELATT has quite a diverse group of students, and most of them had been in the UK between 1 and 6 years. And actually many had, almost all had completed lower secondary, and some participants were at quite a high level of prior education level. In the chapter, you can read a lot about their profiles of the participants, but because we don't have much time today, I may have to, I'll skip through, but give you a flavor of who they are. So my first participant here, Elma, she was a refugee, had fled as a refugee as a child, and was living in had lived in a refugee camp in Egypt, where she met her husband and came over to the UK. But unfortunately, that marriage broke down. So during the research period, she had to overcome quite a few challenging situations, such as housing and also hospitalization of her kids and herself for emergencies. Flora came to join her husband, and he unfortunately died suddenly when their daughter was 3. So when she started the research project, she was still going through quite a lot of grief and was homeless and living in a hostel and had many challenges with regards to housing and getting support for herself. Lucy also came to join her husband. She actually had a very high level of education and was used to working in university. And it was very demotivating for her not being able to gain employment in her profession, a specialist area. And also in her stories to me, or in her narrative to me, she experienced what I perceived to be quite a lot of racism from her husband's family and stepchild, but she herself didn't identify, well, only once did she identify it, but it was quite interesting to kind of see her experience and what she was going through with regards to her confidence levels. And finally, Samira, she's a refugee from Afghanistan who came with her husband, but unfortunately he suffered from PTSD and a lot of mental health issues. So during the research project, apart from caring for her husband, she was also caring for her child and dealing with housing issues that they were having as they were living in really overcrowded accommodation. So that's just a really short brief.
Nafi,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but we're starting to run out of time. So
Okay.
go about 5 more minutes. So get onto the findings as quickly as possible.
No problem. Thank you, David. So what was the relationship between social interactions and belonging? Well, they participate. Firstly, I wanted to look at their places of interaction, and I found that women participated in broadly these four places these four spheres, places within these four spheres. So when I talked about local community, that was really with other parents at their children's school or people from their ESOL class, their ESOL group. These were the two main areas. And the nature was really supportive, and they were giving people advice and making social conversation and helping each other with language practice, for example. Within the public services sphere, they took part in interactions with staff working in government offices, local authority, health services, and the nature of these interactions was, as you'd probably imagine, quite formal and instructional. There wasn't much social conversation as such. Two of the participants were involved in the work sphere. One of them in a customer-facing job, which actually meant that there was a lot of social conversation involved. But the other person didn't have any interactions really in English because their work wasn't in an area, in a customer-facing job. And finally, in the home, which again was an area that I didn't study as part of this research. And so with that information, I was able to kind of create maps of everybody's social interactions in spheres. I can't really say much about this here. It didn't feature very heavily in the research in the end, but I thought I'd share it quickly. So some of the main discussions were that, the importance of friends as a replacement for family was one of the first things that came through in kind of my analysis. Migrants experience quite a lot of loss and a loss of family connections and support networks, so they have to create new relationships. And so the social interactions that they take part in, certainly in the community sphere, really help them to create these new relationships and also give them more support networks. And as Elma's quote here, they became the family that the new family for these participants. There was a real interesting finding for me, which, something to note for me, which was how online tools were used. And I'd been delivering ESOL for a long time and found that actually after the courses ended, there was not much interaction between participants. There was kind of a lack of follow-on. But actually with this group, because of their use of electronic communications, especially specifically WhatsApp, relationships went out carrying on well after formal courses had continued or concluded, and it really helped bridge long periods of absence. And actually what I found was that they maintained and built on the kind of relationships that they'd already accumulated in their groups over time. So that was a really interesting point that I hadn't expected before doing the research. And also the value of weak ties. Participants took part in interactions with acquaintances and strangers as well as people that they knew well. And these are just things that, as an ESOL teacher, I used to not really value. I thought, if someone said, "Oh yes, well, I said good morning to the shop assistant," I would say, "Well, no, you need to go and practice English with people and have long conversations with them." But actually, I underestimated how important these interactions were to build trust in other people and in local community, and of course, positive interactions meant that people felt more confident about, whoever was in their local shops or, working around their local areas. But if there were negative interactions, and in this research, especially participants talked about kind of negative interactions with public services like the housing office, and we all understand some of the constraints that are there on kind of those service providers, but any negative interactions then reduce their confidence to access or participate in that. And then that then affected when they had to go into an unfamiliar place. But there was a real point that was made that there wasn't much opportunity for them to have social interactions with people that would be considered host community members or settled community members. Almost all of the social interactions reported were with people like them, other refugees or migrants who were settling in the area, or people from their own ethnic backgrounds or families. And trust, this was something that came through. And Elma's quote here I thought is really, it means a lot, because she felt that if you can't understand someone, they can't understand you, then you can't trust, and neither can they. So they themselves identified that trust was key in developing relationships. And they talked about the role of their ESOL classes in helping them to live, to develop trust, first and foremost, for most of them. And the communication in a shared language, but it wasn't necessarily the language itself, it was the cultural knowledge and awareness that came with that learning of or communicating with someone else in that shared language. So the development of their confidence in language skills really positively affected their confidence to take part in social interactions. And then this affected their feeling of relational belonging with others. So my main findings were that social interactions supported them to access a community, this key thing of building understanding and trust, and gaining cultural knowledge to develop those relationships. And as I mentioned to you, the value of the acquaintance, the social interactions with acquaintances and strangers was really important. And it also supported them as part of that, which I just said, it's that learning of cultural knowledges, practices and behaviors that are not formally taught within a language lesson as such. And the role of language, most of the time it's placed within this idea of cultural knowledge, but actually language underpins the whole process of access to material belonging, access to place and participation, that obviously the interactions with others as part of relational belonging, but the development of that cultural awareness of how people do things in this area, how, and what their contribution to that is with what they bring to their new places or their new environments. And so, yeah, my conclusions were that social interaction supported women to build trust in people who were different to them, to learn those cultural knowledges, practices and acceptable behaviours not formally taught in their language learning lessons. And these knowledge and behaviours were actually what supported migrant women to gain access to and feel ease in unfamiliar spheres. And I have a list of kind of implications and recommendations, mainly that as language teachers, I think the out of class experience is something that we need to think more about. But I'm not saying that all teachers don't, but I think there's a lack of understanding of what people are needing and doing outside of their language lessons. Hopefully policymakers can look at this research and consider this when planning for future programs. And certainly other organizations can also take on some of these ideas to see if they can design programs that bring the formal and informal and non-formal together, and definitely a more joined up approach with the in-class and out-class activities, for example, things that are led by volunteer groups in the community. Oh, and I think that's it. Thank you so much. I'm really sorry for going far over time, David. I'm not sure how I'm doing there, but I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand back over to the host. David?
Is he still here?
Yeah, well, there is a question here, Glenn. Are you happy for me to answer it?
Please do, yes,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, so Rashid says, you spoke about the narrative by the media and politicians that women refugees are reluctant to integrate and learn the language. As you work closely with these women, can you please enlighten us on their willingness to integrate and learn the language of the host country and what obstacles prevent them from doing so? Wow. I mean, that is a big question, and a lot of what I wanted to set out to show. from working with, I think just to rewind that, the idea of, you know, learning a language is, as an adult, is a really large and complex challenge, especially for people who are not settled themselves. So if you think about, I mean, looking at my own experience, as I'm not going through many other challenges in life, touch wood, you know, I can set myself to learning something else or learning a language, which is a really big task. But when someone has very recently been through the experience of trauma, is going through usually quite a lot of immigration process to enable them to be able to live somewhere, has really precarious housing situations, is the main carer for the family. There are many challenges in place that mean that person is not necessarily in the right frame of mind, if you want to talk about it simply, but not in the right place to learn. And so organizations like ours really think about what barriers are people facing, and how then can we support them to have, you know, what can we do to support them to minimize those barriers? So for example, if they are the main carer, is there something we can do to support them with childcare? If they are going through really difficult mental health situations, do we have a counseling service that can help them, or are they already getting those services? And, you know, many others, but not all organizations do look at it from that holistic point of view. A lot of, for example, well, there are language schools or language organizations that maybe only focus on the delivery of in-class qualifications, for example, and may not have the resources to do lots of the out-of-class support that I just mentioned. But also the idea of learning, you know, in terms of how we learn, and sometimes that's influenced by our own education background. You know, some of us haven't had the most positive secondary school, primary school experience, and so there is also potentially a challenge to what someone thinks a learning experience would be. And the other thing that, you know, with my understanding of language learning or language acquisition is that it is a very participatory process, and it's hard work. And actually, if someone has been used to a way of being, you know, like a rote learning, for example, or learning that they think should happen via, you know, reading, just being receiving information in books, they might be surprised at how difficult it is actually to develop, especially speaking and listening skills in a different language. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in with this. I can see that Becky's here as well. I think you've got a lot of experience of people who, you know, really would obviously want to learn the language. They want to be able to support their children in school. They want to be able to, you know, speak to people freely, or be able to travel across different parts of town without feeling a lack of confidence, but then really find that there are obstacles that you know, are in their way. Glenn, Anna has a hand raised. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Anke.
Glenn, I suppose you take over, because we just got a note that David's internet crashed.
Oh.
Yeah, he's back, but somebody's going to have to make him co-host again, I think.
Oh, sorry. Let me just see if I've got that. If the host came to me by accident. I'm a co-host. Anke, you're the host. So
I'm the host?
Yeah.
Okay,
you're the host somehow, but Anna.
Okay, good to know. Then I make David the host again.
And actually, if Anna wants to ask a question, somebody's going to have to let her unmute her microphone. I can't, for some reason, I don't have that.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for that presentation. I relate as an EAL and ESOL teacher to what you were sharing, and I do find that one of the biggest barriers that post-compulsory education students find is the lack of funding in the ESOL lessons that used to be more popular. They used to be more available, and at the moment in the area where I work, they rely on volunteers, so there is no structured funding even though, and this goes back to Anke's research, even though taking English at a certain level, the exam is part of the requirements to apply for British citizenship. Even though the test is compulsory and you have to pass at a certain levels, which is different from Germany, there is no government funding to provide ESOL courses to adult learners. So I think that the biggest barrier, and perhaps this one-way system that we were also discussing earlier, is that it is important for you to get this level of English, this level of language, in order to belong in paper. However, in the everyday practice, we are not going to give you that. You need to rely on the kindness and goodwill of somebody like yourself that is also doing a research. So that is my experience. There's not so much the intrinsic motivation of the student, but the external context.
Thank you, Anna. And I think one of the, because I think we have to wrap up, and just to hand back, definitely funding is a real issue, and the appropriate type of funding. So in the UK, it's very disparate, sorry about that. And so, you know, a lot of the main funding is about people getting jobs, but that might not be suitable for new arrived, you know, refugees whose first aim is to be able to get orientation in their new area. And David's back.
I am. Thank you, Nafisah. Yeah, apologies for that. I was, as happens, I was kicked out of the room and just got back in, and I've just been made host again by Anke. Thank you, Anke. So I've missed the discussion there, which I'm sorry about, but I will look back on the recording. There will be a recording of this. I presume. Can you still hear me? Oh, everybody's frozen in front of me.
We hear you.
You do hear me. Fine. Sorry, this is. Should have got over this after 2 years of doing this. We should not have these sort of problems still, but we do. I've just put into the chat a link to the centre's webpage on WordPress, where there's you'll find when we post the video, we'll post a video of the discussion of the seminar, and there are also previous videos of seminars there that you can also see, and future events. We've got a number of other events booked in, and there will be more. So do keep yourself up to date with that. I will close this seminar now then. Thank very much my colleagues Glenn Levine West, Anke Grotlüschen and Nafisah Graham-Brown, and also the other contributors to the book who are in the room here. It's wonderful to hear a couple of voices, and it just seems a shame that we don't more often. We write papers, but we then don't sit around and talk about those papers with the other people who wrote papers about similar things. And I think the more discussion we can have of that sort, the better. So hopefully we'll be able to facilitate more in the future. For now, unless there's anything that Anke, Glenn or Nafi want to add, I'll close the event and say thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Nice.